Hey folks, picture this. It's the dead of winter. The wind howls like a disgruntled goat, and the frost is clawing at your throat with the enthusiasm of a teenager who just discovered caffeine. Welcome to a medieval peasant's night shift on the coldest, most unforgiving night of the year. Before we plunge deeper, smash that like button if you love a gritty history bite, and drop a comment with your favorite "I can't feel my toes" story. Now, dim the lights, pull a threadbare blanket over your shoulders, and brace yourself for the chill that makes even the fireplace shiver. You wake up on a rough, hewn pine floor, the thatch above you sighing under the weight of snow like an overloaded inbox, while the scent of damp straw and burned wood mixes with the metallic sting of frost on your nose. You try to huddle with a family of 3, sharing a single, splintery wooden bowl of porridge that feels more like a bowl of lukewarm mud than a meal, all while the creaking beams sing a lullaby of, if you survive this, you'll survive anything. And the darkness outside whispers, maybe tomorrow we'll invent socks. And I'm curious, what's the most absurd way you've ever stayed warm when the thermostat betrayed you? In a remote valley of the 14th century, the first bitter winds arrived like a rumor, sudden and hungry. Peasants drifted to a single modest hearth, little more than a ring of stone, and a pile of damp wood that sighed blue smoke into the rafters. They pressed shoulders and elbows close, trading the rough scrape of wool and the sour tang of hard cheese for a few inches of warmth. Children sniffled. An animal somewhere coughed a lunge of breath that smelled of hay and urine. The whole space smelled of smoke, sweat, and those old, stubborn smells you only find where people have always lived. There was a kind of rough humor in it. Someone joked that even the wind needed a permit to be this rude. And the irony was plain. Community felt warmer than the hearth. Mara stood by the fire with hands as cracked as oak bark, humming a tune to steady a baby on her hip. She stitched a child's sleeve with needle and flax so slender it might have been a bone, fingers moving as if the cold couldn't slow them. She mended not just cloth, but hope. Her breath ghosted white, and you could count the lines of worry in the way she folded the child's cloak. Practical geometry learned from years of frost and famine. She had what the men called resilience and what she called stubbornness, the sort that outwits a landlord or a wolf. And she joked, half a grin, half a snarl, that she could beat a knight in a staring contest. No armor needed. There was humor in her work, too. She called lice, the original roommates, and flicked them like lazy spark. In this valley, laughter kept more heat than any blanket. Tomas the carpenter smelled of sap and iron, and his hands still remembered the lee of timber sleeves, even when he hugged his cloak close. He'd been whittling a peg by the hearth. His knife sang a small, honest song, and the shavings curled like pale ribbons on the dirt floor. When talk turned to the communal shelter he built every autumn, Tomas pointed to joints and pegs as if they were lines on a map. Where to pile turf, where to leave a gap for smoke, where the rafters must bear the sky. The shelter was no inn's feather bed. It was a long hall of patched thatch and pressed earth that smelled of damp sheep and old stew. But it held 100 bodies in its ribs like a crowded choir. He made jokes about their accommodations being rustic translation, medieval Arab, and then, with carpenter's pride, set his back to the wall and did the small, stubborn things that kept the valley from freezing solid. They spoke then of a night colder than memory, a phrase that fluttered through the hut like blackbirds, and hands moved with sudden purpose. Stoves were banked with embers and stones warmed until they hissed, then wrapped in cloth and tucked under bedding to give off a shy, steady heat like a sleeping beast. Men and women traded ale for broth, boiled turnips, until their skins split, and the smell of sweet root rose to mask the sour tang of long days. They layered hides and straw, traded stories about old remedies, the hot stones, the spiced tea, the smear of grease behind the ears to keep frostbite at bay, parts of a recipe older than their lord who lived in his warm tower. There was grim humor too. Someone pretended to enroll the frost into their accounting books, as if they could ledger their way out of winter's teeth. When the cold settled, it arrived with a sound like a closing door, and a high, thin cry through the valley, as if the landscape itself had gone to sleep and left a draft in its chest. Inside the shelter, the air grew precious and muffled. People leaned together, bodies and blankets, creating small islands of heat, breath fogging like lanterns. Mara tucked her children tight, feeling bones find bones, and the steady thump of a neighbor's heartbeat that steadied her own, while Tomas coaxed embers back to life with a careful breath that blew sparks like tiny fireflies. They sang a crooked hymn, off-key, gutsy, and more effective than any hymn sung in the church. And someone snored like a war drum, which made them laugh. And for a moment, the frost seemed less enormous. This was frost-bound beginnings, a small valley learning to survive the cold with makeshift cunning, stubborn warmth, and the kind of neighborliness that would have made even a king's court feel underdressed. The night was not yet won, but neither were they alone. Mara stood close to the elder as if the old woman might cough up sparks, pinching the sour, oily smell of flint and char between her fingers. The elder's knuckles were knotted like roots, and she taught Mara how to feather a tinder bundle, how to cradle the first cough of smoke so it didn't die like a shy animal, and how not to breathe in the black powder that made your eyes water. The instructions sounded like a prayer and a punchline at the same time. None of this was Gandalf-level magic, just patient, filthy technique practiced by hands that had known hunger. When the steel kissed the stone, a gold spark popped, and the hut filled with the tang of burnt hair and hay. And Mara laughed, because the fire looked stupid and miraculous at once. She left with a scrap of ember in a clay bowl, and the sensation that she carried a secret heavier than her dirt-stiff gown. Tomas and the laborers moved like a single, clumsy animal through the frost, the cart wheels whining, and the horses stamping steam into the blue dawn. They hustled down alder and blackberry, swearing at knots, and at the way wet heartwood hissed when it split, the air full of the sharp bite of sap and iron. Hands smelled of mushroomy rot and old sweat, nails packed with splinters, while laughter bounced off hedges, because complaining together is a kind of warmth. They stacked logs in a haphazard cathedral by the longhouse, a leaning patchwork pile that promised long nights of flame if only the wind behaved. Tomas thought of his grandmother's story about a winter when the village nearly ate the cart wheels for fuel, and kept that image like a dare. Back at the longhouse, the younger men became woodwrights and tinkerers, slamming shutters into frames and sealing cracks with wool and beaten leather smeared in animal grease, which smelled faintly of pewter and stew. They drove nails with the rhythm of a drum, until even the pig slunk out of earshot, and one apprentice proudly presented a shutter that fit so snugly it squealed when they tried to close it. A small, triumphant sound. Someone joked that it was like one of those fancy DIY shows, except the host had no power tools, and the studio smelled of onion and dung. The joke landed because it was true. Wind whined outside like a hungry dog, and each sealed gap turned that howl into a memory, proof that clever hands could make walls keep secrets. By evening, the house breathed easier, as if it had been given a patchwork coat stitched by many palms. They experimented with bedding like alchemists, layering straw, old rags, and sheep wool, until the pallet looked like a small, suspicious haystack, full of crackly promises and the occasional flea. The straw hissed under bodies, and dust sent tiny sunbursts into the candlelight. While the first night someone discovered that damp straw made a bed that smelled like a wet cellar, and produced a ruckus of sneezes and curses. Children balked at lice, and adults traded remedies, combs, vinegar, the grimy comfort of hot ashes rubbed into boots. All the gross, intimate work that winter teaches in a hurry. They learned to sleep in tears, the warmest bodies huddled at the heart, while the cyclists of heat, the dogs, a cat with board-approved attitude, a grandmother with too many stories, did their slow, living insulation. It was messy, itchy, and brilliant, and it took every set of shoulders in the hamlet to invent enough warmth that didn't smell like a funeral pyre. When the fire at last took true hold, the room glowed like a coin, and faces emerged from the dark, as if carved by the flame, glossy with melted candle tallow and stew fat. The elder watched Mara and Tomas trade proud, exhausted smiles, and the village sounded like a flock settling muttered gossip, a rough joke, the scrape of a spoon, a child humming some tune that would not shame a minstrel. The hearth held not just heat, but the cunning inventions of many small brains. Embers banked under pots, dried birch bark tucked into cracks, shutters that kept the gusts at bay, and beds that ferried body heat like tiny barges. If you listened closely, you could hear a kind of agreement rustling through the house. We will keep this life together, keep the flame, pass the old rites along. There was no central heating, only the cooperative, stubborn genius of people who knew that a living hearth was the village's beating heart. The blizzard arrived without warning, a white wall that gobbled the road and left carts frozen in the ruts like hulks of old ships. Winds shrieked through the thatch and sent knife-edged needles of snow across faces until cheekbones burned. Farriers and millers cursed and hacked at ice, while mothers banged pots, so the children would not sink into frightened silence. Smoke from the longhouse chimneys smelled of wet peat and char, and every animal in the yard huddled close, breathing warm ghosts into the cold. We joked that even the monks on the hill would have switched from chance to Netflix if they could, which is to say, nobody expected a grace period. With the road buried, the reeve called a meeting, and the village turned its hoards into household commons. Sacks of rye came out of holes, and hands began to measure. They flattened coin circles of ration on wooden spoons, counting mouthfuls like monks counting beads, while the smell of rehydrated dried meat, tough and gamey, tugged at the corners of hope. Young men dug shallow pits in the lee of the earth, lining them with straw, ashes, and coarse wool to keep root vegetables and grain from freezing solid, an art not unlike prehistoric insulation, but less polite. They wrapped loaves in oiled leather and buried them with an ox cart wheel to weight the lid. The ground felt like a chest you locked with muscle and superstition. There was an improvisational cunning to it, half craft, half prayer, and the constant clacking of dice and knives became the new clock. Hunger sharpened tongues faster than any blacksmith's hammer, and small cruelties bloomed, stolen handfuls of barley. Doors left ajar so cats could slip into the storehouse and into guilt. Old grievances resurfaced like rot in stored turnips. The man who had bragged of his fat pigs grew thin, then humble, then enraged when his bragging offered nothing to fill a belly. A woman hid a crust in her apron, and cried when the child at her breast reached for it. The pious muttered that charity would save them yet, and some muttered that God must be on strike. Tension hummed in the rafters like trapped wind, a sound that made stitches pop in patience. When morale sagged, the village did what it always did, gathered close, crowded around the low fire, and made music from what they had. Spoons, fiddles with one broken string, voices like splintered boards that somehow joined into a tune. Old Hedda told the same war story for the 100th time, adding a new curse at the end. And everyone laughed, with mouths full of thin broth, until the walls seemed to lean in. Children chewed on dried apples and clapped while a shepherd improvised rhymes about kings who could not weather their own cold, our local version of a bad sitcom. If sitcoms had lice and mud. The songs soothed more than ears. They loosened shoulders, brought warmth to numb hands, and turned the longhouse into a theater of shared stubbornness. Even the sullen began to hum, a low, dangerous hope that felt as solid as the nailed planks underfoot. Day after frostbitten day, the village kept the rhythm of survival. Ration, dig, mend, sing, until the word tomorrow lost its promise and became a tool. They buried the ones who could not be saved under white shrouds and marked the graves with carved spoons, a grim joke that made even the grave diggers chuckle in the dark. When the thaw finally crept in, not cinematic, but slow as a miser paying out coin, the lanes opened, and the first cart that rattled in felt like an invading army. Only it carried flour. People emerged with faces rimed in salt and soot, forever altered by the taste of scarcity and the memory of hands that shared more than food. The frost left scars on fence posts and on stories, and the village went on with a comic, stubborn pride. They had survived the kind of cold that teaches you to hoard your laugh as fiercely as your last crust. The ice moon came down like an accusation. A sky so clean it made your lungs ache when you breathed out. The cold had been climbing for days. Each morning, a sharper knife at the throat of the village. Men and women moved like old clocks, gears stiff with numb fingers, and every breath showed as a tiny ghost that evaporated against the thatch. The hearth sputtered as if insulted, coughing up black smoke and embers that only barely climbed the chimney, and the smell of wet wool and old sweat mingled with soot, while toes in ruined boots turned traitorous. Someone joked about dragons, Game of Thrones style, and the laugh cracked like thin ice before it died. At night, the walls began to sing, creaks and pops like a chorus of old bones, as timber shrank and spat moisture into the dark. Every rafter told its own complaint. Beyond the fields, the river had turned traitor, so solid on top it looked like glass. Yet the ice snarled and heaved into ridges that could dam, and then break in one monstrous belch. We heard that belch as a far-off groan, a sound you felt under your feet as much as you heard, and it made children hug their sheepskin cloaks tighter. Tomas walked the bank with a torch, jaw set like a forge's clamp, because a frozen river with feelings is a dangerous thing. Mara, who could sew a boot blindfolded and outdrink half the younger men, refused to wait for luck. She remembered the old buried stone oven at Old Gert's lot, the sort of stubborn heat trap villages used before convenience, meant asking someone else to carry water. They pried up sod and frost, a smell of raw metallic earth rising, and sparks flew as they coaxed coals from the dying hearth into the oven's belly. The stone kept heat like a secret pile in embers, a pan of stew and damp rags, and it would breathe back warmth for hours, turning the air into something almost kind. People pressed faces to the warm stones like stray dogs at a hearth, cheeks thawed, fingers uncurling with small, painful pops as blood returned. Tomas answered Mara with the kind of stubbornness that had made him famous for refusing to give 2 inches of a doorframe. He lashed planks and iron bands across the village doors so they fit like a lover's brace. They tamped wool and smeared tallow into the seams, making a living seal that smelled faintly of mutton and triumph, and the drafts died as if mutinied. Inside, oven heat and bolted wood turned the longhouse into an island of warmth. If you can imagine summer with smoke and boiled turnips, that is, someone grunted that they'd invented a medieval space heater, and the truth was both filthier and simpler. It worked. When the worst hours passed and dawn came pale and angry, the river snarled and then relented, unable to flood the homestead because folk had put a line of flesh and hot stone between it and their children. Boots glittered with ice crust, beards wore frost like bad pastries, and one man discovered his fringe had frozen into a small, noble helmet. They catalogued these humiliations with a grim, grateful glee. They ate the soggy stew anyway and laughed at the taste like old soldiers, praising Mara and Tomas until their voices cracked from use. Later, the night of the ice moon grew in telling bits of heroism, a dash of lie, a seasoning of comic relief, because a village that can laugh about almost freezing to death will not freeze to death that night. At first light, the valley sighed as ice loosened its grip, and the peasants blinked like creatures returned to the world. They pushed open doors crusted with hoar frost and stepped out onto ground that steamed in pale ribbons under the sun. The air tasted of smoke and peat and the sour tang of long-kept cider, and every drip from thawing eaves sounded like a coin dropped into someone's palm. After months of nights that felt like living inside a frozen belly, their bodies straightened, and they laughed in a rough, astonished chorus, part relief, part disbelief. They brought out the food as if it were treasure. Hams smoked until they shone like old mirrors, bowls of thick pottage rimmed with fat, and roots scraped free of the last stubborn snow. The central spit crackled, casting amber light on faces blackened with smoke, and children reached through the crowd for marrow to suck. And you could hear the wet, greedy smack of teeth. Ale foamed in wooden trenchers, sweet and sour, and strong enough to make an old man confess to dancing with a cow if the mood struck him. They told the story of the cold nights between mouthfuls, each retelling spicier than the last. The night the door froze shut became the night we built a boat out of mattresses. And everyone winked at the ridiculousness. They spoke of fire not as a commodity, but as a creature to be minded. How to bank embers under ashes to keep babies warm without burning the barn. How to coax a coal like you would an old horse. A boy demonstrated the art of feathering kindling, thin curls of wood that catch fast. And an elder made a joke about tinder before anyone realized they'd just made a pop culture pun. They taught each other the rules. Never leave a spark to breed in the eaves. Build a fire break of stone where the thatch leaned close. And always, always keep a leather pail of water at hand. In simple, blunt phrases that sounded like commandments. The smell of smoke on sleeves became proof of worth. And the one who had once hoarded the best kindling apologized with a grin and a promise to share the next winter. They recited salt, smoke, and cool earth like a litany. Salted hams kept for lean days, smoked fish hung like garlands, and root cellars carved into the hill where the air sat steady and slow, salting, rubbing meat with coarse crystal until it tastes like the sea and survives the winter, was explained with a laugh and a dab on the tongue, because the best teachers are also taste makers. There were tricks that smelled foul but worked, burying cheese in ashes to keep maggots at bay, wrapping cabbage tight to coax it into sour life as sauerkraut, and storing apples in straw that smelled faintly of mouse and old summers. They compared notes like modern hackers comparing apps, trading methods, and swearing that Grandma Edla's smoked beef trick beat any city recipe, which earned a chorus of skeptical guffaws. When the feast thinned to embers, they carved marks into beams, names of babies born through the cold, tally marks for survival, and hammered them home like postcards to the future. They sang rough songs, some bawdy and some nearly hymns, and taught the children the jokes that would make them brave when the wind went cruel again. There was irony in how fragile their memory-making felt, ink on wet wood, breath on a child's neck, Yet each laugh and oath polished those moments into legend. As the sun climbed and the valley warmed, they stood together, dirty-knuckled and triumphant, and resolved that the lessons of fire, food, and fellowship would be hammered into the days ahead, until dawn of warmth became less a miracle than an inheritance. Snow stole the light from beyond Eldermere, and the hamlet drew itself into a tighter circle, as if the houses feared being seen by the night. By dusk, the newly built communal hearth stood like a stubborn sun in the square, bricks black with fresh mortar, and a smoke that tasted of peat and iron. Villagers shuffled close, boots spitting slush. Children with runny noses pressed the heat to their cheeks, and dogs nosed at the embers like hungry philosophers. The wind tried to steal sparks, but folk hunched lower. The smoke braided into hair, and the air smelled of wet wool, burnt fat, and the small sweet rot of overripe apples. Myra, the elder keeper, circled the hearth with a confidence that belonged to someone who would sooner scold a wolf than seed a coal. Her hands were a cartography of burns, flour, and ash, and the scent of smoke clung to the fold of her apron like a jealous child. She fed the fire with peat and dry oak, murmuring old rules about timing and ember lighting the way prayerful folk recite the creed. When she spoke, her voice scraped like a poker across hot iron, and people obeyed because she could coax life from idle coals, not because any scribe had scribbled her a title. Honestly, she was the village's Wi-Fi. Everyone came for connection, though what they got was gossip, stew, and the occasional stern look. Tomas arrived with a shepherd's staff and a grin, as if winter were an adventure rather than a slow, frost-biting teacher. His cloak smelled faintly of sheep and last night's mud, and he stamped and blew on frozen fingers with the impatience of one who has learned patience by counting disagreeable sheep. He dropped a boot too close to the embers, and they hissed, sending ash dusting his lashes like an ill-advised mascara. Myra pretended not to tut, but her eyes crinkled, and she handed him a twig to poke the fire. He handled it like a novice, wizard with his first wand. Half in awe and half afraid, he'll set his own map aflame. The hearth did what a dozen stone cottages could not. It dried sodden cloaks, boiled the communal pot until meat released its stubborn flavor, and gave midwives a place to steam linens when water outside had turned to glass. Stew sputtered and popped, sending up smells of salted pork, marrow, and the guts of a cabbage that had seen better summers, while slices of blackened bread huddled on a spit like shipwrecked men. Mice took liberties at the edges, brazen as pickpockets, and the fire's heat drew them like tiny conspirators to the crumbs. Arguments about whose turn it was to fetch would happen as predictably as frost. But so did Mercy's, a mittened hand to steady a pot, a loaf split and offered despite hunger, the blunt, honest magic that kept bellies full and fingers from frost when pots simmered and hands were warmed. The hearth's truest work began, telling stories, not the neat bedtime kind, but ragged, useful tales that teach you how to spit rot from meat and where to lay blame when a goat vanishes. Myra leaned back and let the flames throw her face into chapters of light and shadow while the villagers leaned in. Because here language was currency and laughter a warm coin. Someone swore on a broken boot that a fox had borrowed a chicken and looked just as guilty as any man accused of pinching bread. And that was the sort of proof that passed for law on a cold night when Myra drove her poker into the coals and the first spark jumped free. There were no trumpets, just a long, shared exhale that meant, in the only language they needed, we will see another morning. Snow drove at Eldermere like a vendetta, plastering shutters and piling over door sills, until the village looked like a set dressed by a mad playwright. The wind keened through the crooked chimneys, and the only sound besides the rasp of ice on wood was the steady, hoarse respiration of men and women huddled by doorways. Smoke curled from the great communal hearth, but grew thin and insubstantial as wet logs hissed and steamed instead of burning. The scent of damp smoke, boiled cabbage, and cold sheep filled the air. Children stamped their boots on packed snow and spat out icicles, while elders blew on their fingers and murmured old blessings, as if saying them could knit warmth into the world. By the second day, the woodpile looked like a conspiracy, half the logs soaked, half rotten, and the rest thin as kindling meant for candles, not a village hearth. The reeve scratched his beard and announced rationing, which landed like salt in a wound, each family twice as cold, each hearth a contested throne. The weavers argued they needed steady heat to finish damp-dyed cloth, or else the colors would run and ruin a season's wages, while the farmers complained that their animals would perish without warmth, and that a dead ewe can't pay taxes. You could taste the argument on the breath of the market. Iron tang of fear, the sour tang of boiled turnips, the ever-present grit of sawdust in the teeth. Tempers snapped when Tom the ploughman accused Myra the weaver of stashing kindling under her loom. A charge Myra answered with a laugh like dry reeds, and a list of Tom's unpaid tithes. Words became gestures. A stool hit the hearth rim, sending a shower of sparks that made everyone jump as if they'd seen a ghost. The weavers' shawls smelled richly of lanolin and wet dye, their fingers quick and stained like old knuckles after a brawl. The farmers' hands were cracked, dark with soil and the smell of hay, and they thundered about property and honor. Old rivalries climbed out of corners, slights remembered, marriages broken by a quarrel over a single split log, the invisible accounting of favors never repaid. The hearth, that ancient convener, found itself at the center of a very modern reality show. Alliances formed in the heat, betrayals plotted over the smoke, and irony sat heavy as soot. Men stacked wet wood with angry hands, boots sliding, while women fanned embers with lids and curses, coaxing life from the glowing heart as if it were a temperamental beast. Someone suggested a lottery, someone else a duel of spoons, and finally old Hild, who tended the coals like a priestess tending relics, stepped forward with a plan that made people groan and laugh at once. Through it all, the storm battering the roofs offered a brutal soundtrack. The slap of drifts, the staccato rattle of frozen eaves, the low groan of a cart struggling against the road. Hild brokered a truce, shared watches over the hearth, a schedule that put heat where it was most needed, and kept the whole village just warm enough to sleep. And it worked, clumsily and humanly, like a bandage on a cold wound. Men smelled of smoke and sweat and humility as they sat shoulder to shoulder, while the embers flared into a tentative peace, the taste of thin stew somehow sweeter in common vessels. Yet the victory smelled faintly of ashes. Grudges didn't vanish. They just hid under cloaks, and Myra and Tom still shot one another looks like flint on flint. By dawn, the blizzard had no interest in village politics, but Eldermere had learned the hard lesson that the hearth holds more than fire. It holds truth, grudges, and the stubborn warmth that sometimes, reluctantly, keeps a community alive. Myra called them to the common hearth as twilight sank like a wet cloak, and the village answered with slow steps and suspicious lanterns. She promised a night of trading knowledge, stories sharp enough to sting, songs that would make old men grin, and craft lessons for sticky fingers and knotted rope. The hearth spat and sent up a smell of wood smoke and burned marrow that made visitors cough and laugh at once. Even the miller, who claimed he could heat his house with his own stubbornness, shuffled in. She arranged benches close to the fire, so faces glowed like coins and hands reached for each other's warmth like thieves. A weaver taught a hitch that saved a hem and a life. A young mother showed how to cure a ragged bandage with pitch and vinegar and a prayer which smelled like burnt syrup and made some people wrinkle their noses. A traveling bard, half competent and half hungry, traded verses for a crust and struck a tune that made children clap as if they'd discovered sunlight. Sparks popped like tiny beasts and settled on cloaks, and the air tasted of smoke, sweat, and a bread gone wrong. There was laughter and competitive boasting, the kind that keeps a village awake through winter and makes an old grudge look small as stories unrolled and songs coaxed the truth. Private needs slipped from pursed lips. Herr Joran needed better rope to haul his wife's harvest. The apothecary needed someone to peel nettles quickly without cursing. And a mute boy needed a spoon shaped for his small palm. The confession felt like watching someone pick at a scab, awkward, a little gross, but also strangely healing. People surprised themselves by offering what they could spare: a patch, a lesson, a pair of calloused hands, because the fire made honesty cheap and comforting. Myra kept the talk moving with jokes sharp as hearth tongs, reminding them that shame dries faster when shared. When the pile of usable kindling dwindled and the flames began to breathe thinner, Myra stood and proposed a trip into the dark wood to fetch standing fuel. And no one laughed her off. They wrapped in boiled wool and leather, marching under a sky rimmed with stars so cold it felt like someone had opened the roof of the world. The forest hit them with a smell of wet earth, resin, and 100 small animal perfumes. Boots sank in half-rotten leaves, and one villager shrieked when a squirrel knocked something down like an improvised drum. They found rotting trunks that smelled like old cheese and caked grit under bark that smeared onto their palms. Someone slipped in mud that squelched like a disliked pudding. Working as a messy, begrimed team felt ridiculous and cinematic, at once equal parts ancient survival and a medieval indie heist. They returned with a clumsy triumph. 2 wheelbarrows, arms scraped and noses raw, and a stack of wood that smelled like victory and damp rot. Back at the hearth, they fed the flames with careful kindling and watched as the fire swallowed the wet trunks, hissing like a creature pleased, while the crowd hummed and passed around a mug of something medicinal and brown. Alliances formed. They were tentative as frost on River Reed, but they held mended ropes, shared recipes, a promise to watch each other's smoke in the night. Myra sat with soot on her thumb, smiling at how a single idea could turn a cluster of nervous neighbors into a willing gang, the sort who'd fight wolves, or at least steal the last pie for each other. The night ended with a song half remembered and wholly true, and the hearth kept them until dawn. A small sun in the long cold that somehow felt like home. A sudden gust shoved a tongue of flame into old Marta's thatched roof, and the house answered with a roar that smelled of pitch and roasted straw. Sparks climbed like greedy beetles, and a black column of smoke stitched the sky, turning the sunset blood-red, as if the day itself were on fire. People poured into the lane barefoot, tossing blankets and squinting through smoke that stung like onions, the kind of stinging that makes your eyes taste metal. At the center, The communal hearth glowed like a lighthouse built of embers, its steady orange a ridiculous comfort against the panic. They didn't stand around philosophizing. They moved like one wobbling beast, passing buckets, dragging barrels, and heaving wet sacks toward the spreading heat. Someone hoisted a cauldron from the hearth, not for stew, but to pour a boiling distraction of steam across the eaves, because medieval problem-solving often involved whatever pot you had, and the mental acuity of a feral cat. Old Tomas, who swore at everything including the sky, held the hearth's biggest brand like a ridiculous torch from a minstrel tale, applying its concentrated heat to singe away small patches of thatch, so the bigger fire would have less to eat. It looked like controlling a beast by poking it until it behaved, and it smelled of wet wool, charred hair, and the sweet, almost pleasant tang of roasted barley. Someone joked that it was Game of Thrones without the dragons or the HBO money, which made the children laugh amid the coughing. Upstairs, in the choked gloom, families coughed and clung to beams. As smoke painted their throats black, men and women crawled through rafters and hauled them down by their elbows. A young mother passed her babe through a window like a hot parcel, its hair singed and its cry thin as a reed. And a boy with a nose full of soot grinned like he'd been in a fight and won. Hands were cut and raw from heaving ladders. One lad tasted iron when his tooth met a splinter and spat blood into soot-streaked fingers that still found the courage to hand up a cloak. Smell and sound braided together, the bitter of smoke, the metallic clang of buckets, the muffled sobs and curses, until rescuing felt less like heroism and more like the only practical option. The showdown came at the lane's narrowest bend, where the fire leapt like a kettle gone bull crazy, and the villagers turned the hearth into a cunning weapon. They laid wet ropes and smothered underbrush, using the hearth's controlled blaze to burn away a thin ribbon of thatch on their terms, making the main fire's hunger follow a path they'd cut. An old widow, famous for selling lousy pies and excellent advice, barked orders while spitting into a glove and misquoting a proverb that somehow worked. Leadership in crisis is often delivered with spit and sass. Men and women felt blisters blossom like angry flowers on their palms, the heat pressing against them with the intimacy of a jealous lover. Yet they pushed the flames like you would herd stubborn sheep. It was ugly and loud and magnificent in a low-key village way, more thrilling than any tournament and smellier than a dragon's armpit, which is to say, very, when the last lick died to smoke, and a few gusts carried embers like grudging confetti. The village stood amidst a new, awkward quiet that smelled of wet wood, burnt ale, and triumph. Cottages wore new crowns of black, rafters rafters hung like bowed heads, and the communal hearth, sullied with ash, sat like a bruised friend who had saved the day. They counted the losses and the blessings in the same breath. A roof lost, a neighbor's pig singed to a crisp, yet 3 families whole and blinking in the sun like survivors of a silly, terrible adventure. Later, children would poke the old ashes and pretend to roast marshmallows, which is absurd. Marshmallows are a future problem. But for now, the blaze of crisis had become another winter story, told around the very hearth that nearly set the village to cinders. At dawn the hearth lay dead, a grey mouth of cold ashes that smelled of burnt ale and damp wool, and half the village seemed to hold its breath. Men and women drifted in, noses stinging from the sour tang of smothered embers and the sharp, bitter smell of yesterday's stew gone wrong in overturned pots. A dog nosed at a single coal that refused to catch. Children stamped their feet until the floorboards complained, and old Tom swore like a smith whose hammer had snapped. There was grim humor in the curses and fear underneath. Frost rhymed every window, and the air felt like bad coin, thin and useless for keeping anyone warm. For a moment, the common room was as helpless as a market without ale, and everyone felt it keenly, like a Wi-Fi outage in a craftsman's life. They did not sit and mope. Villagers moved with the blunt efficiency of people who have learned to fix small disasters before supper. The Reeves barked orders that sounded almost polite. Roll the stones, fetch the dry birch, grind clay, and 2 women hauled a heavy slab that scraped like a whetstone across the dirt. Lads scrambled up the rickety ladder for beams, while old Agnes, who had a laugh like a crow, set the hearth's plan on a flat palm and declared it would be larger and meaner than before. There was irony in the work. In better weather they bickered over whose pig rooted whose garden, and now they were architects and masons, a kind of impromptu guild. It felt like a village council rewritten in charcoal and muscle, less fancy than Parliament and more honest by light of flicker. They set the first stones with hands raw from cold and callous, tamped a mortar of clay mixed with straw until it held like a promise, and the air filled with the sweet, damp scent of earth. Someone boiled leftover fat to seal gaps, and the smell of rancid bacon mingled with wet clay and smoke, unpleasant and oddly reassuring, like victory through the stomach. Men bit their lips, women spat to clean their palms, and a child shrieked when a nail broke under a hammer. Splinters flecked faces, and soot crept under fingernails like a small, stubborn sin. The work sang with noise. Stones clacked, ropes creaked, curses popped like kernels, and the kettle's belly thumped against the new stone, as if testing the hearth's heart. It was gritty, It was gross. Hairy nettles stuck to sleeves, boots squelched in leftover slops. But every unpleasant thing turned into a stitch in the village's coat. Once the stones sat square, and the lintel bedded firm, they hauled the embers home from other chimneys with a solemn, ridiculous ceremony that made everyone grin. Ashes were passed like relics, and a child carried the first spark under a tin lid like a pale torchbearer. The smell of frightened smoke rose, and then settled into something tame and domestic, like a beast finally petted. And the first little tongues of flame licked the new iron crane with a sound like dry paper. An old woman who had outlived 3 husbands and a plague tapped the kettle twice and muttered a blessing that was half prayer and half punchline, because habit and humor keep people alive. They hung a trivet and set a blackened pot to boil, the sound of bubbling broth knitting a new rhythm into the room. The hearth was no longer just stone and fire. It had become a badge, stamped with soot and shared stories. At last the blaze answered properly, roaring into life with a noise like a small, hungry beast that had been fed. And the whole hall exhaled as one relieved animal. Warmth pooled outward in slow, greedy waves, shoulders relaxed, cheeks flushed, and fingers that had been blue returned to pink, sticky and smelling of coal and lard. People clustered close, trading jokes, gripes, and a bit of stale bread, and an old man dozed with his mouth open, and a pea of cold porridge crusting his chin, a grotesque, honest end to hard work. Someone joked it was less Game of Thrones and more a sitcom reunion, and laughter tacked the jest to the rafters like a banner. The new hearth glowed steady, a stubborn, living thing that promised to bind them through many more winters. And when the embers settled, each face in the ring looked like a page warmed by firelight, inked with soot and solidarity. The valley wakes with a hiss like a kettle left on the fire, wind slicing the grass, breath frozen into ragged steam. Myra, cheeks raw and hair matted with hay, squints at the pale sun and thinks of nothing grander than keeping her toes attached. The village huddles in a loose ring of smoke and stone, dogs whining, older hands cursing as they pry ice from the well. There is no courtly banner here, only laundry flapping like surrendered flags, and the smell of wool burning at the edges of an ever-hungry hearth. The answer comes from the ordinary: sheep, a dull knife, and the stubborn fingers of people who have stitched luck into cloth for generations. They shear, they card, they spin into a rough rope that bites the palm and smells of lanolin and manure in a way that is somehow comforting and appalling at once. Myra learns to strip the fleece into bands, pulling apart mats that look like old cobwebs and coaxing them into straight, stubborn threads. When the village lays those strips in layers, They hear the soft rasp of wool rubbing wool, and the sharp, pleased exhale of someone who has made warmth out of near nothing.